This lesson is about gouache. You're probably thinking gouache, that's a funny word to say, so G-O-U-A-C-H-E. It is the water-based medium that is most like tempera. It's got a binder that's a little bit of gum arabic, and it will feel most familiar to what you might have used in elementary school. It feels most like the tempera medium. I love using gouache. It dries velvety, you get a very subtle, deep color. It's one of my favorite mediums. Because of that velvety texture, it doesn't reflect light, it absorbs it, which lends to that velvety texture. So, in this lesson, we're going to work with preparing a board to paint with gouache. We're going to talk about how to achieve an even and flat surface for a more graphic look with the gouache. We're also going to create a variety of textures using thinner line work and a technique called scumbling. So again, gouache is like a more sophisticated tempera. It will give you deeper colors. You can layer with it because it is used opaquely. The white chalk filler is what allows the gouache to be used opaquely. And again, there is a binder in it that is not in your school grade tempera paint. That's the gum arabic. It is water soluble and typically used for opaque coverage in earlier stages. It can be thinned down with water to be used as a wash. But you have to be careful with the gouache because if you put down a layer and you kind of what I call scrub back and forth with your brush, the work surface will not seal and you'll bring up those other layers resulting in mud. So remember that gouache is always water permeable. That means as you're working with it, you have to watch your brush strokes. And when you want to frame your beautiful finished project, you have to protect it. You'd want to put it under glass or under plexi to avoid, I don't know, throwing a cup of coffee on it, okay? You can paint with gouache on paper, but I am using board because if your paper isn't thick enough, it will ripple. As soon as you start hitting that board, that paper with water, it will ripple. We're going to talk about how to prepare this board for using gouache on it with gesso. The first thing that we really need to talk about is getting the board this size. So you may purchase a board that is typically, say, 18 by 24. You're going to need to cut it. I've chosen a thicker board to avoid that ripple. It has a wonderful surface. It's very satisfying to paint on. But it's a little tough to cut, so we're going to talk about that. What's really, really important is that you are using a nice, heavy utility blade, not a thin X-Acto knife. That blade will wobble and you won't get a straight cut. So the secret is patience. You must cut using a metal ruler and very slowly repeat your line. I like to get down on the floor because I can get all of my weight into both the board and the ruler and repeat that cut several times. Don't get impatient and rip, you'll get a jagged edge. So if you want to get a nice clean edge, ruler, weight, fresh blade, nice heavy utility blade. And now we're going to hit the board with some gesso. Let me explain what gesso is to you. So this is my naked board. If I just paint on this directly with the gouache, the board is going to soak in the water and my paint will feel really stiff. So the gesso is used to create a barrier that helps the paint adhere not to the board but to the gesso. So it's a barrier between your paint and the board. So I have a small jar of gesso here. You do not need to mix this with water. The consistency is absolutely perfect the way it is. I have a dedicated, larger, flat gesso brush. This does not have to be a very expensive brush, but it's important that it's bigger and flatter and that the bristles aren't really stiff because we don't want to be leaving really big marks on the board. And the way to avoid leaving those big marks is to, in one layer, because I'm going to do two, in one layer to go in one direction. Just keep loading up your brush. You can see when I run out, it gets a little scumbly. There's that word again. We also have a trick to keep this board from warping. As soon as you wet one side, it wants to start curling up. So when I'm done with this, I'm going to make a sloppy wet X on the back side of my board. Okay, so I'm going to smooth this out. I'm going in all one direction. That's fabulous. And I am going to make a wet X on the back of the board. So here's my water bucket. X marks the spot, and this will keep it, or sort of counteract its natural inclination to warp, and then I have to let it dry. Okay, so I've switched boards on you to show you a perfectly dry, smooth board on which I've done a second layer. Now I have some students who like to use a perfectly smooth board, so they might do a layer and then sand and then do a second layer. But really the trick to getting it reasonably smooth is just going in one direction, as I did, second layer, other direction. Here's my board, perfectly flat. I'm ready to go. We're gonna start painting some swatches, okay? The trick to laying out flat, beautiful, consistent color is, as I say, you want your gouache to flow off your brush like mayonnaise on a hot summer day, okay? So that means I'm always fussing with the water. I'm not going to paint directly out of the tube. As you see, I'm going to start mixing two swatch colors that are going to end up looking a little bit like this, okay? So we have warm swatch with cool brush stroke over it. We need contrast, otherwise you can't see what we're doing. So we have warm, cool, cool, warm, dark, light, and light, dark, and then we have some complementary line work. The line work has to be opaque, and you want your swatch opaque as well. So let's start mixing. Okay, so as I said, we always want to use a little bit of water. I've squeezed out my palette so that I can pull the paint and not contaminate the major part of the blob. And I'm using a warm cad yellow and some red. Another trick is a mister. I have two misters here. This is my tried and true traveled everywhere with me mister, and it is just a used, cleaned, emptied hairspray bottle. You can also buy a nice, perfectly clean mister in the art store that looks a lot like this. Okay, and that's just a really good way of getting some water happening on your palette without having to continually dip your brush. Another trick is you've got to use enough paint. If you don't use enough paint, your coverage will be not opaque and not consistent. So it's not just getting the paint on the board, it's how you get the paint on the board. Mixing is really important. I want the mixing to happen on my palette, not on my board. You've got to watch out for surprises, what I call surprises on your brush. So kind of try and clean off those edges a little bit, and I'm going to hit the board. The fewer strokes, the better. But while it's still wet, I can work into it. Just going to start laying that paint down. See how it flows so nicely. Now, you'll notice I'm doing long strokes, and I can also try and hit my edges with a nice long stroke this way that cleans up that edge. Another thing that helps with opacity is mixing a tiny bit of white into your paint. Even if I don't want a lighter value, the white is just more of that chalk filler that aids in the opacity, so I could hit it with a little bit of that. So here is my warmish red-orange swatch, and I'm going to rinse my brush off. The great thing about water-based media is cleanup is really easy, and it also means that I can keep my brush pretty clean pretty easily. Got a nice big bucket of water going on here, and now I'm going to mix a cool color for my cool swatch. So let's start with primary blue, or excuse me, ultramarine blue, a little bit of water. And let's make this a bit of like a blue violet. So now I'm going for my cool red, that's the alizarin. And you know what? In this one, I will show you the white because violet tends to be super dark. So a little bit of white, and we bring that value up, and I don't have enough paint happening here, so I'm gonna take a little more. Mix, mix, mix. A little more blue, a little more white. I think we're good. And there's that beautiful velvety quality we're talking about. A little more water. So because it's a water-based media, the minute you start squeezing it out, it wants to start drying, and that is the, again, always fussing with the water. So here we go with some nice even strokes. And again, make sure you have enough paint. And we get a nice even coverage there. And what's really important about keeping your colors clean is waiting for the paint to dry before you go over it. So you want to work wet into dry. Otherwise, you will get your mud. And that's it. I'm going to give this a moment to dry. It's water-based. It will dry super quickly. And then I can work on the line work over it. I can do hatchings. You'll see me do some curvilinear work and some scumbling, which is using a drier brush, less water. It's almost like the brush is stuttering over the surface and letting you see through to that other color. But wait for your work to dry. Okay, we're gonna start doing some line work. I made a few more swatches. Remember that there are several different ways to create contrast. We're gonna do a warm with a cool work over it, a cool with a warm work. I'm being tricky on these two, and then I'm gonna do light, dark, and I'm also gonna do complementary contrast. So let's start mixing for some line work. We'll do some cool work over this one. Please remember that you want to use enough paint so that the line is opaque. And sometimes I have to fight with my watercolorist because watercolor wants to be transparent. When you move to gouache, if you're working with gouache, most of the time you want to be opaque. So I'm always telling them to use more paint. So use more paint. And I'm going to go cool, but also a little bit lighter. Remember that the white really helps aid in opacity. It's also reducing the value a little bit, so we have a light over dark. Now, a lot of students think that if they hold on really tight and really carefully, they will make the perfect line. But the truth is, if I'm standing and I can use gesture, if I move my hand faster from here, I'll get a better, more flowing, even line. This is a round brush, small, thin, with a point. If I press hard, I will splay out. So I want to keep my touch light and moving, and I will get a thinner line. This is also a good synthetic brush. You don't want to use the bristle brushes or the squirrel hair brushes because they do not keep a point. You'll be very frustrated. All right, so I'm going to make my line and keep that hand moving. I can do cross hatching. I can do loose curvilinear work, like that. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off. We're going to do a warm light over the violet, because the violet's kind of cool. So let's do the warm cad red over this. And we're going to always fuss with the water. It's too sticky right out of the tube. Remember that mayonnaise on a hot summer day, maybe August. And again, thoroughly mix on the palette. You don't want any surprises on your brush. It's also a good idea not to spread your blob out too big. It's hard to gather your paint up, and it makes you look like you actually have less paint to work with than you do. I think I'm gonna go a little bit lighter here. Mix, mix, mix. You have to enjoy the mixing process. No streaks, and we're ready to go. Again, so I'm going to do some cross hatching, and I think that could be a little lighter. Let's get a little more white happening in there. A little lighter value. It will also, again, help aid in the opacity. And let's do some curvilinear work over that. Maybe some fancy dots. The gouache will dry a little bit darker. So you may think you have a really light value, and as it dries, it gets a bit darker. So you may want to push your colors a little lighter than you originally think. Do a little more with the pink because it's fun, and then we'll move on. Okay, so we've got a light green here, the complement of green. Oh, look, it is pink, but we have light, so let's do a red over the green. So again, I'm pulling my color from the corner, and people often wonder how it is to work with these little tubes. I've done huge paintings with just the little tubes because you do so much mixing and you add white. So they do last a very long time. Also because you're always mixing a little bit of water into them and a little bit of white. All right, so let's do some work over the light green swatch right here. And get that crosshatch. Ooh, you can really see that. See, the faster I move my hand, the smaller I can make those strokes. If you look at early frescoes, it's all of this line work and this hatching. And let's do some fun curvilinear stuff. Woo, fun stuff. I don't know, maybe some dots. So you can see we've got a nice contrast of dark red over the green, cool over the warm, light over the dark. Here I've got a cool blue. The complement of blue is orange. So it's a secondary color. We have to mix a secondary. So we're going to start with the warm yellow because it's heading towards warm. That's your cad yellow and your warm red. Now, when you're mixing your secondaries, you always want to start with the lighter color and drop the darker color in. It could take a whole tube of yellow to change the red. It only takes a drop of the red to change the yellow. I think we're going to add a little bit of white to this as well, so we don't have dark saturated over dark saturated. And again, I always like to add a little bit of white because it helps with the opacity. A little bit of water. Here we go. So we're doing some hatching. Ooh, nice. This is a little bit more of a yellow orange. And let's make that a little more orangey. And some fun stuff. A little more hatching. Okay. You can, once this is dry, continue to layer. I could take this orange and go back in here. Ooh, nice. So I love layering and doing, the interaction of the color. You could just keep going. Gouache is pretty wonderful for that. The one thing we're going to do last is show you what scumbling is. It's a fun word, right? Okay, so scumbling is a drier brush that sort of stutters its way across your surface so that you can see through to the other colors. Let's do a little bit of scumbling on the green with kind of like a light blue. Where would you use this? Well, you could use this maybe in your sky, maybe when you want to get an optical mixture of two colors. You'll notice what I'm not doing is mixing colors on the surface. I'm not blending here, all the mixing happens here. You really don't want to be working wet into wet. I also have no blended edges. For the swatches, we're keeping everything kind of flat and graphic. Okay, so we've got a blue happening here, and I need, as I said, to keep my brush dry. So I'm actually gonna work with a towel in one hand. It's a bigger brush. I switch back to a bigger brush, and I'm gonna start to sort of, it's not dry enough. We're gonna dry that off. Put the paint on, and it should start stuttering. There it goes. That's it. So you have a texture that lets you see through to the paint underneath, creating kind of an optical mixture, and that is scumbling. All right, so now that you have an understanding of the basics, in the next lesson, we'll use what we know to paint a lemon with our gouache.